Dr. Cameron, I'm back again, and I'm here with one of my favorite doctors of all time. He's a champion, a leader, and he's when I came on the scene in 1987, starting to notice Lyme, already Dr. Joe Burrascano had been wrestling with these Lyme disease problems. So thank you for coming, Joe.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So Joe, if you reflect back on that career that started so early, it must have been an exciting journey.
Always. You know, anytime a newly discovered illness becomes part of your practice and you evolve as the illness evolves, it's always very exciting. I remember every year something new came up. You know, we first learned about seronegativity, then we learned about the need for chronic long-term treatment, then we learned about Babesia, then we learned about Bartonella, then we learned about SPECT scans, and every year some new development happened, which was exciting.
Well, I think that there's this era now of what they call evidence-based medicine, where they think every last thing's got to be a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. But many questions aren't. They're not treatment questions. They're just diagnostic questions. Or there's issues of that you can't wait for a trial and everything. And so what you've done year after year is, while we're waiting for evidence-based medicine, is keep writing a paper and collecting everything you newly discovered so that at least doctors could start from somewhere. So how's that been going?
Well, you know, I always thought that it would be nearly impossible to do evidence-based, randomized controlled trials in Lyme because it was so complex from day number one. I mean, we didn't have just Borrelia from Lyme, we had the co-infections too. So how could you isolate a patient and say, we're going to just study amoxicillin versus Ceftin for Lyme disease when you have all these other co-infections? How can you determine the effect of the immune system of having Lyme Borrelia when you have Babesia and Bartonella going on? So it's such a complex illness that I don't think it's amenable to very simple-minded, black and white studies like that. And in fact, my impression is pretty much correct. The trials that were done in the early days, as you know, as an epidemiologist, you can answer these questions yourself, but for example, the Klemner study was all very one-dimensional. Even the Fallon study, unfortunately, was one-dimensional. And he mentioned, gee, some of our patients have seropositivity for Bartonella. And that wasn't addressed in the study because that wasn't the design. So I really can't see how this kind of a complex illness, with all the manifestations and all the ramifications, can be distilled down to a black and white A, B, C blood test type of a study.
Well, I think that, I'm an epidemiologist that sees it from more of the science end.
Yeah.
How do you design a study? And as a clinician, you were saying, well, gee, is that there's so many things in a tick.
Yeah.
And it seems like every time you look at it, each of those things is important. That Babesia is so important. And it's not just one strain of Babesia. There's anaplasmosis and Ehrlichia, for example, the Bartonella we've been talking about today. But the NIH trials did only focus on one organism. The Klemner trials in Fallon was on Lyme disease alone. And in practice, it's, if they're sick 9 years, like in the Columbia trial, I'm not very comfortable just focusing on only one disease. If somebody's still sick, I'll move on to looking at some other co-infection.
Well, I think the answer has to be animal studies, using a primate model or maybe even a pig, which is actually pretty close to humans genetically, and do a study with just Borrelia and get some solid answers that are not delayed 10 years like the EMBER study. And then do a study with Bartonella, and then do a study with Babesia. Then you start to do studies with Bartonella and Babesia and Lyme. And you work that way through with valid animal studies where you can control it one illness at a time. You can't take a population of Lyme patients who are bitten by ticks maybe more than once with many co-infections and immune function problems and autoimmune problems and hormonal problems and neuropathy problems and expect to get a single clear-cut answer that applies to all Lyme patients around the world. It's absolutely impossible.
Well, I think that if you look at the Klemner trial, those two trials, they were sick 4.7 years, three previous treatments. So they were working with people who were failing that linear, simple treatment. And I think that when we look at ILADS all along, we've said it's not going to work very well with a single linear one organism approach.
Yeah.
That you might have to look for longer treatment, might have to look for combination treatment, look for the co-infections, and I think that's why those NIH trials didn't really answer the question we wanted them to.
I guess the simplest way of putting it is that all Lyme patients are different. They have to be treated as individuals, seen as individuals, and that's why it's important to have a knowledgeable primary care doctor who spends enough time and enough energy on your one personal case and doesn't put you in a little cubbyhole, some kind of a study, and treat you like everyone else.
Well, I think at one point you used to talk about Bartonella-like organism, waiting for the science to catch up.
Yeah.
And it seems like that this ILADS meeting, the science has gone a long ways toward understanding of Bartonella, that it's fulfilling that goal you had is not just a term, but the science behind it, the different organisms behind it, and so that was great. So,
well, two things about that. One is that I'm pleased that my prediction from 5 years ago is now being proven scientifically, and that's neat. But what's even more neat is that here a clinician, could be me, could be any other Lyme-related doctor, is coming up with deductions and thought processes, and then using that to develop treatment regimens based on clinical things that he or she sees right in front of him in the office, and not waiting 10 years for a study to get done and reported and analyzed. It just shows that you can have face-to-face, one-on-one medicine and do good science at the same time.
well, I know you took some heat for a while by saying what we know now.
Yeah.
Early on, you said all these things we're doing now that we're presenting at ILADS meeting, you were a pioneer and right up front saying, this is complicated, it's multiple organisms, this is the treatment you have to do to get where you want to go. And so it's always been nice to have you in the guard up front.
Well, you know, in medical school, one of our professors said a very profound thing, and you know what that was? He said, listen to the patient. I mean, it sounds so simple, but you know, in a new illness, and Lyme really is still a new illness, tick-borne diseases, the doctor doesn't know, the doctor learns along with the scientist. So you have to listen to the patient and learn from them. And I always thought about treating patients, it was a therapeutic alliance where the two of you work together to figure it out and do what's best. And that's how we've evolved so well.
Well, I think there's a role now for patient involvement.
Always has been.
But evidence-based medicine, they always think it's all trial. Yeah. But half of it, or a third of it's trial, a third of it's clinical expertise, and a third of it's patient values, listening to the patient, working out with the patient, shared decision-making. But on expertise, we're, at this particular point tonight, working on the physician training program. Yeah. We're trying to raise funds for it through the Power of Us on the ILADS website. We're also trying to introduce some awareness of the program. If you know a physician that's out there that's on the fence, encourage them to spend a week with someone who knows Lyme. So do you have words of encouragement for the physician training program?
Definitely. As you know, it was my former patient, Stacy Groden, who said, you know, I'm good at raising funds. If you had your wish, what would you like to do if we could raise some funds? I said, I'd love to see a way to take what we're learning here and expand it and teach other doctors. And so through the organization she formed, which at the time was called Turn the Corner Foundation, they began a program of funding ILADS to develop a training program and clerkships. And I was one of the original physicians who actually took other new doctors into my office and showed them scientific articles, went through the process of teaching them how to approach a Lyme patient. And it's taken off since then. And for complex illness like this, it's like the old days of apprenticeship, where you learn from the books and you watch the videos, and then you go to the doctor's office and you learn from the physician and the patients with hands-on experience. It's fabulous. I don't know of any other field in medicine nowadays where physicians are taught so intensively and so effectively.
Yeah, it's amazing how far Stacy Groden went with you to get the physician training program off the ground and grow it and develop it. So I'm awfully happy for all that you did to start that program. I I think she's with Turn the Corner First, but now it's called TBDA.
Right, Tick-Borne Disease Alliance.
Yes, and so I think that's great. But there's a couple questions that some of the viewers on the streaming had. So
Well, let's go.
The first one is, what are you working on now?
I left my practice in 2006. I don't see patients any longer, although people still call me to try and find me. And I began working for a biotech firm, a consulting firm, and we consult with big pharma and small pharma and laboratories and research facilities. And that's what I do full time right now.
And so right now, the company you're working for has developed a test, a culture test. And because culture is supposed to be the gold standard, and we've been wanting a culture, and we got a culture. So I assume that we're making some progress. I know it's available.
Yeah.
So is it promising?
All right, we can start from the beginning. The consulting firm I work for was approached by this laboratory, and the laboratory said to the consulting firm, we want to develop a high-value test. Do you have any ideas? And so as a physician on staff in the consulting firm, I was volunteered to take on the project, and I said, I have an idea, and it was the Lyme Borrelia culture test. About 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, I worked with Alan McDonald, supplying patients for his own culture studies, and he was the first to develop a successful blood culture for Borrelia. It was never commercialized, but with this consulting firm, working with that laboratory, we were able to resurrect his work, advance it through Dr. Eva Sapi at University of New Haven in Connecticut. Took 2 years of research and God knows how much money, because I really don't know how much money it took. And now they did develop, and it's now commercially available and published, a reliable blood culture test for Borrelia. And it's a complete game changer. When you have Lyme, the standard testing, if you want to call it that nowadays, being a serology or a Western blot, has two huge problems. Number one, it's not accurate. You can have Lyme and not show in the testing. And number two, it only reflects past exposure if it's positive. So if you're a Lyme patient and you've been through some treatment, and now you're done with your treatment and you don't feel so well, well, you could have had a relapse, you could have had a new tick bite, maybe the thing never was completely gone, or maybe it is gone and now you have a co-infection. The current serology test absolutely cannot help you figure this out, but a culture test can. What that means is the blood is taken from the patient, it's processed and incubated, and if the germs are there, they grow. You see them, and if you have a positive test with this culture, not only do you receive a piece of paper that says the test showed it, you actually receive a photograph of the very Borrelia germs in your bloodstream that they found. So for example, let's say you're a patient who got a tick bite, or at least was exposed, and you received some antibiotic therapy, and you are much improved, but then say 3 or 4 months later you start to feel sick again, and you did an antibody test, a standard serology test for Lyme, it might be positive. Now, does that mean you have a positive test that reflected prior exposure that you know about? Could be. Could it mean that you got a new tick bite? Sure, it could be. Or could it be that it was a relapse and you're sick again from the same old infection? It could be too, because that test doesn't answer that question. It's possible you got a new tick bite and the new Borrelia blood culture test will show that.
So you're saying is that Dr. McDonald, who was in the movie Under His Skin, he was the one in the basement with the dog, that his work, because he's done a lot of great work, that got picked up, and when they consulted with your company, then they were able to move it along. They worked with Eva Sapi, because she was able to work on patients and controls, and they're able to show that there's the right way, that the culture was positive on people who had Lyme, and it was negative on the controls.
Right. When you have a new test, of course, it's very important to have validation. So what they did was they chose a very highly select group of patients with known, well-documented Lyme. They were positive by the strict CDC case definition criteria, which means 2-tier positivity or EM rash witnessed by a physician. And they tested them, and of those patients who fit those criteria, the positive rate was 92%. Now that compares to about 48% for a standard serology. Also what they did in that study, they took healthy normal patients and tested their blood 48 of them. And out of the 48, 0 had a positive test. So in other words, there were no false positives at all. So we have a test now which is not only more sensitive than a serology, at least in a well-defined CDC positive Lyme patient, it's also the kind of test that has no false positives, unlike the serologies as well.
Well, it's amazing how good this culture is as it come out of production, because of course, all tests take a little while because people get to use it and they validate it, but it's there aren't many tests that are as promising as this that starts out, and so I think there's always people waiting around for how does it work with less validated, with where there's what do you see in practice, but I'm very encouraged by having a test like this.
Well, it is a starting point. It's the first generation, if you want to call it that, and there's one publication, it's a good one, that talks about the test. But the lab is not done. They're ongoing with their research, and they're trying to make the test even better, and they're trying to maybe make it less complex, results sooner. And so they actually are still calling for physicians to submit patients who could be candidates for the study. And so if there are any physicians out there who might have Lyme patients who are CDC positive, and the physician would know what that means, then the patient would be checked for eligibility to enroll in the studies. The advantage is a patient gets a full battery of testing at no cost, and also adds to medical science and maybe helping develop further this great test.
So it's like a give back to the community to offer well-defined cases, that at least for now.
Yeah.
Then with that well-defined case in certain settings, they can give back some of the results and try to move the field along so they can see if they can replicate the results. Here's a question on culture tests. Having too many positives, is the lab addressing this? So I think you almost answered that in terms of you have controls.
That's correct. There had not been a criticism of too many positives. The question has always been, when you have a positive culture, how do you know it's Borrelia and not something else? And the lab has done a number of different things to show that. And in terms of positivity, the lab has now processed many thousands of tests so far in the couple of years that it's been available. And the overall positivity rate is only 38%. So in other words, physicians are sending blood samples in from patients who maybe don't have Lyme. Now, if there's some contamination issue or some oversensitivity, you would expect all the tests to be positive. But number one, in the controlled study, none of the controls are positive. And in the real world, the positive rate of the lab is about 38% so far. So I don't really see any signs of contamination. Plus, I've followed some patients through this. As you know, I'm not in practice now, but I do have a circle. And the patients who I know have Lyme, or at least I believe have Lyme through other physicians' work, their cultures always were positive. And patients who I really don't think have Lyme, their cultures were negative. Not, of course, that I'm the gold standard myself, but the test is consistent with what I as a clinician have seen.
Well, I think that, you've been a good observer, and so it's nice that it fits your observations. Now, does the culture go back to negative when someone seems to be clinically well? Do they have many results like that?
Well, I wish I could answer that question with data, because the problem is the lab is a commercial laboratory. Its role is to process the testing. It's not in a position to ask every patient their whole medical history, and so they don't have that data. From this ILADS conference, which is such a great networking event, I've been able to connect myself with several database people who are developing large Lyme databases who want to work with the lab, so we've really got those kind of answers. All right, so now the short answer, though, is that I have seen patients who had been through treatment who I believe were well afterwards, and their cultures remain negative. So that's encouraging also.
Right, I think that's always good to get a few observations before we dive in, and it's just nice to see it. Now, here's a couple quick questions just to try to help the stream that come in. Address, how about this overstimulation problem, like all the time?
Some Lyme patients really feel like they've been drinking caffeine by the gallon. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is an autonomic neuropathy where the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system is out of balance. The sympathetic nervous system is what's manifested as too much adrenaline. So if that's an imbalance from autonomic dysfunction, that would be one cause. The other is that The Lyme infection, through its inflammatory cycles, will inhibit the function of your blood sugar, not only in your blood peripherally, but in the brain itself. And sometimes the brain, which only can use sugar as its fuel, has insulin resistance and not enough sugar getting from the blood into the brain. And a very simple way of trying to fix that is using a high-quality oil like coconut oil. And I read a recent article, and I found it to be very fascinating, that they treat their patients with a tablespoon of coconut oil every 8 hours, because it lasts 8 hours in the brain. And miraculously, a large percentage of these people stop feeling this overdrive of rushing, especially if they wake up in the morning feeling this. They take a tablespoon at bedtime, and it makes a huge difference.
Well, one thing about you, Joe, is that you're always thinking.
I hope so.
Is Lyme curable?
Is Lyme curable? You know what? I don't know if that's even necessary. You know, I say that because in Lyme, the goal is to get the patients to feel well and do well and not need antibiotics and treatments forever. Now, in our systems, we harbor germs that could potentially be toxic to us and harmful, but they don't do that because we have a balance between the germs and the immune system. So in treating Lyme, it's always been my goal to not only decrease the number of germs with medications, but to boost up the body's defenses through good living and whatever supportive therapy is necessary. And it's been my feeling that once you get the balance in favor of the body and the spirochetes go below that threshold, then you can stop the antibiotics. And if the patients continue their good habits and the supportive therapy, the Lyme remains in remission. Now, does it mean every single spirochete is gone? I don't know, and probably not important. We still have, for example, staph and strep germs on our skin, and we don't get infections day to day. Also found through my years of practice that if I got the patients to the point where there has this favorable balance, they're able to stop the antibiotics and remain well. If they remained well for 3 years, they would not relapse at all.
Now, in terms of the physician training program, I know you're going to go to the fundraiser.
That's right.
But you know, this whole evening, these 3 hours is to try to really look at what ILADS can do with the physician training program, what we can do with professional conferences where we can blend all these specialists together. But we are trying to raise money both tonight at the fundraiser, but we also have the possibility of raising money through the ILADS website, through the Power of Us, where people log on, give money. So can you give a shout out and
well, I'm glad you brought it up, because if you didn't, I was going to. Many people out there want to know, what can I do to help? And I realize that many Lyme patients are financially strapped, because that's the reality of this ridiculous illness. But there's a possibility to go on the website, the ILADS website, ilads.org. Go to the Power of Us campaign, and you can find individual people such as myself, yourself, and if you want to support us emotionally and financially through ILADS, you can make a donation. And it could be $5, $10, $20, $1 million would be nice, but it allows all of us to feel part of the community and be helpful in any way we can. And the money goes directly to ILADS, directly to the training program. We don't get any of it, of course. And I really think it's an important thing to do. Get involved as much as you can, contribute to the cause. The more Lyme literate doctors there are out there who see the Lyme ILADS point of view, the better for all of us.
Yeah, I think that the Power of Us is not just tonight. It's there, it's set up, so if you have family or friends or foundations, you know, for whatever the cause is, you can create your own little mini cause. People can donate at any time. It's always nice to donate tonight, because it goes in now, and we can make an announcement at the fundraiser tonight of what generated. I know what's already generated is just a lot of enthusiasm, because there's people from all over the country logging on, listening. They get to share time with you tonight, Joe.
And you also.
Thank you. So thank you so much for coming tonight.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.